I'm going to backtrack a little bit just to make this aim of the essay a little bit more explicit. So, what Mill wants to establish is that even though we decided to live in a society and we accept its rules, we also have to set a limit as to how much can the government control in our lives, right? So, according to Mill, that moves us to his theory on ethics, on utilitarianism, the idea that the greatest happiness should be achieved for the greatest number. And he thinks that the majority vote doesn't necessarily have to amount to the same idea as the greatest happiness for the greatest number, right? So I had discussed these ideas, but something that I wanted to bring up is that this idea of the greatest happiness for the greatest number has its foundation on the fact that each and every one of us would have different approaches, different perspectives on a single issue. And that while the government might be the right force to regulate the way in which we deal with others, there are also spaces that shouldn't be open to state observation or to state regulation, right? So if you think about movies that talk about utopian societies, one of the terrors of those utopian societies is that the government can see everything that we're doing and that the government is going to intervene in any small decision that we make. If you think about the political conditions in our country right now, this has a lot of current value, right? There are a lot of political groups that are talking about how our government has become so heavy that they decide everything for us. In New York, one of these arguments is that Bloomberg, with the 32-ounce drinks, has decided what we are capable of drinking or not, and why should Bloomberg be the one who decides that, right? Why can't it be the individual? And what if I wanna drink 32 ounces of coke in one single sitting? He's not preventing me from drinking that, right? So what Mill is trying to avoid is two different things. One, that the government intervenes in our lives in a very excruciating and painful way, to the point where our lives are not really our lives anymore. And the other one is that the government would treat us as little kids, that the government makes decisions for us that we ought to make, right? And that maybe just as parental figures do, maybe sometimes they have to let us choose. Maybe sometimes we are not going to choose the wisest thing, but if it doesn't inflict upon others, then maybe we should still be able to make those quote unquote wrong decisions, right? So this is how Mill comes to the idea of harm to others, that there are a lot of actions that I can take, there are a lot of things that I can do that should be none of it shouldn't be the business of the government, right? That I can make those mistakes, and that actually in practicing these things I will be able to become a stronger person, become a stronger citizen. And maybe if I used to disagree with the government, I would now trust the way in which the government is leading me. Or that if I still disagree with the government, I would be able to formulate the argument as to why I disagree, right? And try to push my ideas forth. So Mill has a very, if you can see from here, he has a really interesting idea as to how the government works, right? That this democratic government is supposed to include not only the voting system, but open forums for people to be able to to talk about what they find relevant or what they find interesting in their lives. So, harm to others is that principle that allows for the individual to self regulate, right? And he states it this way: that principle is that the sole end for which mankind are warranted, individually or collectively, in interfering with the liberty of action of any of their number is self protection. That the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. So I can do to myself whatever I want as long as I do not harm other people, right? Mill explains that his own good, either physical or moral, is not a sufficient warrant for the government to intervene or for my peers to intervene. He cannot rightfully be compelled to do or forbear because it will be better for him to do so, because it will make him happier, because in the opinions of others to do so would be wise or even right. These are good reasons for remonstrating with him or reasoning with him or persuading him or entreating him, but not for compelling him or visiting him with any evil in case he do otherwise, right? So if people think that I am doing something that might be harmful to myself, but it's only harmful to myself, they can talk to me, they can try to argue me out of it, but they cannot bring the government to try to persuade me to do otherwise or to punish me to do something else. To justify that, the conduct from which it is desired to deter him must be calculated to produce evil to someone else, right? This is the only pathway for governmental intervention. If that thing that I'm desiring to do is going to end up causing evil to somebody else in society or to society at large, then the government and the citizens that collectively form the government can intervene in my case. But other than that, they might think that I am a hedonist or that I am an outcast or that I am like this really crazy person, but that's within my domain, right? So Mill is invoking here the principle of autonomy, which becomes really relevant in any liberal government, right? Autonomy comes from the Latin words auto and nomos, so we end up having this idea that we are self-regulated individuals. And if we weren't self-regulated, the whole idea of democracy would fall through, because then we don't have any power, we don't have any reason to endow the government with it, right? So the government can say that I cannot regulate myself, because in doing that, it discredits itself. Does that make sense? So there's this sort of like in the Hegelian master-slave. Yes, the government exists as my master, but it only exists as my master because I have autonomy. That's the way in which I, as the slave, deal with nature. If I didn't have my own autonomy, then my vote doesn't have any value to have a democratic government, right? How would I choose? So this idea is going to be important for Mill because I am this citizen who can make choices. I can decide what's best for me. I can decide where things are not convenient to me anymore. And the government can intervene, right? The government can try to set a path for me. And for Mill, this is the interesting part, that as much as the government wants to do that, it's in its own benefit to leave a part of me still outside governmental regulations. That there are some things that I want to do, that there are some things that I can do, that as long as they're not harming anybody else, would actually produce a stronger self. Therefore, we would have a stronger democracy. right? So there's a problem with the principle of harm to others, because it is difficult to pinpoint when I would be harming other people, especially when Mill talks about a person may cause evil to others not only by his actions, but by his inaction. And in either case, he is justly accountable to them for the injury, right? So this principle of harm to others is going to become this nebulous boundary that I need to negotiate with the government, that there are some things that I might do or some things that I might not do that still make my actions impinge on the liberties and freedom of other people in my society. And if they think that that's the case, then they can come down and tell me, you know what, Minerva, you really can't be doing that because you are harming these other people in our society. A lot of liberal and even neoliberal philosophers and economists deal with this. One of the most renowned neoliberal thinkers is Milton Friedman from the School of Economics in the University of Chicago, and he calls harm to others the neighboring effect. If I am harming my neighbor and my neighbor can demonstrate that the actions that I did are an evil to him or her, then the government can intervene. And neoliberalism aims for the thinning out of the government, but the neighboring effect has been used to create huge pieces of legislation, right? And one of the people who is seen as sort of the opposite to the neoliberal ideas of the thinning out of the government is Ralph Nader, and the way in which Ralph Nader has brought in all these approaches to how my not wearing a seatbelt when I'm driving a car and I have an accident is not only detrimental to my own health, but it actually impinges upon the way in which societal resources are going to be used, because I have to be taken to the hospital, and money that shouldn't be spent on me is going to be spent on me, right? So this idea of harm of others and how these relations are established is going to be the most difficult thing to pinpoint on the principle. And again, like people like Milton Friedman tries to make it so that the government shouldn't intervene, but then Nader takes that principle and he turns it around almost on its head and is like, well, I can demonstrate that there's harm to other when a biker doesn't want to use a helmet, right? That's why we have to have legislation that says bikers ought to wear leather jackets because they're more protective, padded jackets, and helmets, right? So this principle is something that we're going to be discussing, we're going to be talking about, but it becomes quintessential to the idea of liberal democracies, because at the same time we want the individual to be able to regulate themselves, but we don't want that regulation would actually end up being harmful to society, or that it would prevent other people from exercising their rights. So those are the things that Mill is discussing here. And some of the places where you can think about, should we use a harm to others approach, is if we allow for same-sex marriage, isn't that an individual decision? Are we really harming society if we allow this legislation to go through? What about euthanasia? If I want to conduct active euthanasia, am I harming others? Am I not only just killing myself? If I have a company, should environmental controls come from the government, or am I really autonomous and I can decide, right, when to do these things? So this is going to be part of what we discuss online.